It's on now. Got it. Check, check, check. Okay. Can you hear me? Okay. Okay, yeah. Yeah, okay.
Thank you so much, everyone. I really appreciate everyone being here and taking the time to hear this incredible story. Thank you, Peter, for being here. I'm Sarah Chisholm. I think everybody knows. Anyway, I'm the director of lifelong learning here, and I'm really, really pleased to be able to be continuing this social justice series, looking at mass incarceration. Barry and Michelle have been passionate about this for quite some time. I know Barry does a lot of work with Detroit Jews for Justice, People's Water Board. You
Westmoreland Social Justice and Nation Outside.
so right. So it's just it's incredible. And so Barry suggested bringing Peter Martell, and I just thought that was a phenomenal idea. So thank you so much for being here. I'm going to ask Barry to introduce Peter because Barry knows I don't want to mix up the facts. So. Thank you.
Thank you.
We're excited to hear.
So bear with me for 1 minute. I just want to contextualize this to what's come before in terms of this series. And actually, I should say that somehow in conversation with Sarah and Gary, they talked about how as part of our social justice work and series
Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you for having me here. Thanks for the invite, Barry. And thank you all for sticking around on a Sunday afternoon to listen to my talk about mass incarceration and our work here in Michigan. So I'm the Deputy Director at American Friends Service Committee, the Michigan Criminal Justice Program. This program started back in the late 60s with a court watching program where our original director was doing court watch, especially for sentencing proceedings in Washtenaw County, and started to track like racial disparities in sentencing. In the 70s, that was Mark Maurer, who would eventually leave AFSC in Ann Arbor, and he went down to Washington, D.C. to start the sentencing project, which he retired from finally just not too long ago. After Mark Maurer, Penny Ryder was our director. Penny turned the office into much more direct service work. She learned from people who were incarcerated in Michigan's prisons about what was needed, what sort of assistance from the outside was needed inside, and she relied heavily on that feedback and those letters that would come into our office to drive the direction of our office's work. Let's see, Penny Ryder retired in 2010. Natalie Holbrook became the director, and when a position opened up there, I applied for it, and I was hired. And I worked at American Friends Service Committee from 2010 until 2016. At that point, I graduated law school and went to work at the State Appellate Defender's Office on the juvenile life or resentencings that were just getting underway right then. So I was at SATO doing that work for about a year and a half, 2 years. I went to work for Flood Law for a bit after that, doing trial level defense, and at the time Todd Flood was also the special appointed prosecutor for the Flint water crisis. So there was a lot going on in that office and just a tremendous amount of learning that was taking place. 2018, I was accepted into a PhD program at Michigan for public policy and sociology. So I got back into classrooms and back into academic and research and teaching a little bit because after law school, I was really, I guess, somewhat disappointed by what I saw taking place in the courtroom and the lack of knowledge and tools and methodologies and like rigorous training that these people have, whether it's any of the attorneys practicing in the courts or the judges in the courts, like the lack of a solid discipline and training and chops to think about things when every single one of these cases is affecting a number of people in large ways. So I got back into grad school, and then the pandemic hit, and everything fell apart for all of us, right? But somewhere along the way, during the pandemic, there was a sociology class at U of M, Soc 225, Project Community, where undergraduate students at U of M were being placed in different criminal justice sites around the area. And one of them was the Washtenaw County Jail, and another was the Gus Harrison Correctional Facility down in Adrian. And when the pandemic hit, that prevented the students and the instructor from going into those facilities. So the instructor was trying to figure out what can we do with these students who signed up for the criminal justice section. And I felt like, well, one thing that we could do is contact my old friends over at American Friends Service Committee, because they receive close to, some years 2,000 letters a year asking for individual help with individual things that come up inside Michigan's prisons. And we often rely on volunteers and interns to help respond to those letters. So I connected Rebecca, the instructor, with the program director, Natalie, and I think Jack Williams was there at the time in my old position. And we worked with the students, everything remotely, to help them respond to and understand and get a good grounding in like the rules and policies that apply to different issues that people would write to us about. And the students would get responses out to the people, hopefully offering some assistance or at least some knowledge about the problem, about the policy and what was going on, and whether we could help them or not, we always tried to get responses out, often way too late, because it's a huge backlog to deal with, especially when you're scanning everything and using cloud computing during the pandemic. It was something to deal with. So things began to open back up. Jack left AFSC. I was a little bit tired at that point. I'd completed my coursework, and I was a little bit tired of just being in the classroom because like so many people that I knew inside prison who had been there for decades and decades and decades were in serious harm's way with the pandemic and just with what was going on in prison. And I didn't want to be in the classroom anymore. So I accepted an offer to come back to AFSC to get back in the work. What we've noticed at AFSC is the prison population in Michigan has downsized a lot over the past 15 years, over 15 years now. In 2007, we were at our peak. The prison population in Michigan was over 51,000 people in the state facilities. This isn't counting county jails or the federal prison here. In the Michigan Department of Corrections, over 51,000 people in 2007. It's since come way down. We're under 33,000 right now, hovering right around 33,000, give or take the year. And that's the lowest level we've been at since 1990, which was kind of like the high point of the get tough on crime rhetoric and policy that drove all of our prison populations up so much. Certainly wasn't the beginning of it, but that was like the high point of it. So I like to, for a lot of the research that I do, I'll use the 1990 numbers because the population studies gives us a good baseline on how to compare things. Our current prison population to what we had in 1990. What we've seen since that downsizing occurred because of parole reforms for the most part. That's the largest thing that got us from 51,000 down to 33,000. The parole board started to release people who were already qualified for parole. They were eligible for parole, and in times past, the parole board was denying them parole. And starting in 2007, the governor created this Michigan Prisoner Reentry Initiative, where we started to invest some time and energy and some money, a little bit, into people's reentry. And it started like at the last year of their prison sentence. The Department of Corrections would start to prepare people for release, blah, blah, blah. And that was at least some sort of program or initiative to drive towards getting people out of prison and supporting them out in the world. Washtenaw County, probably more than any other county, had a lot of community-based buy-in, where people who own businesses and restaurants, whatever, they would buy in and hire people who were coming out of prison. Because we know if we don't hire people that come out of prison, they're probably going to get back into crime because people have to eat and people need shelter. So the grant rates go up for parole. We also see the Department of Corrections get rid of, for the most part, this zero tolerance for parole violations, where people are sent back for minor technical violations. Maybe they miss curfew. Maybe they're home after 8 o'clock at night, and they get there at 9:30, and the parole agent sends people back to prison for that. That's a technical violation. Nobody commits a new crime. It's just a violation of your parole conditions, and there used to be the time where people would be sent back on a zero-tolerance policy. So that would keep the population up too, right, where people who were released on parole would come back into prison. So we've gotten away with that. Parole agents now are certainly not great, but they're much better than when we had the zero-tolerance policy, and people aren't going back for those little technical violations as much as we've seen before. But now that we're down to 33,000, we look at this, like the demography of who's in prison, and in Michigan, we've got a tremendous amount of people serving incredibly long, cruelly long sentences. And if we go back to like 1990, it was a small portion of the prison population who was serving these really, really long sentences, but also people who were over 40. Now, we've got a huge amount of people who are over 40. We have people who are over 70 and even people who are over 80, and we never had that before. And it's because when we started all of this get tough on crime rhetoric, and this goes back to the late 70s, and we start to use and normalize putting people in prison for the rest of their lives or for really, really long sentences just to become eligible for parole. When we do that, all of a sudden we see this population grow. And when we release people who are eligible for parole, who's left? The people who aren't eligible for parole. So it's like 50% of the prison population right now has to serve at least 15 years just to become eligible for parole consideration. And currently, if you become eligible for parole, you might be denied the first time around, but chances are the numbers are pretty high. The second time around, you've had a chance to complete your programming, and it's a pretty good chance that you'll be released on parole at that point, depending on the offense, of course. So all of these people serving these really, really long sentences, historically and currently, the only way that they can get out of prison is through the governor. The governor in our Constitution has the power to commute a sentence, which is basically like a super judge who can come in and say, this is what the judge gave you as a sentence. I'm going to commute your sentence. I'm going to give you time served. You're now eligible for parole, and the parole board can let you go. You were serving 100 to 200-year sentence, and in Michigan, the 100-year minimum is what you have to serve to become eligible for parole. The governor commutes that sentence and says, you've served 25 years, 6 months, and 7 days. That's your new minimum sentence. So now the parole board can let you go, and they grant parole. It's incredibly political for a governor to grant commutations. We saw a good chunk of commutations granted at the end of Governor Granholm's second term. She couldn't run for president. She was born in Canada. And she granted commutations to, I think between the parolable lifers who were granted release and the commutations, I think we were at about 160, which is a drop in the bucket when we're talking about tens of thousands of people. But it was movement that we hadn't seen for a long, long time. The preceding governor was Governor Engler, of course, and we didn't see many commutations out of him. So we certainly can't rely on this problem that we have now in Michigan's prisons. We can't rely on a governor to commute everybody's sentences. There's just not enough time in the year. If she dropped everything and put a whole panel on this, like, it would still take years and years and years to get everybody released. So what we've been working on at AFSC is half of our office is working on commutation applications for women who are serving these really, really long sentences. And we're also working on what's being called second look legislation, which would give judges the power to reconsider someone's sentence and reduce it once they've served 10 years. 10 years is a long time. We kind of lose track of that. And in Michigan, where we've normalized these incredibly long sentences, 10 years might not seem like that much. It's certainly not that much when I think of somebody who's in there right now who's serving a 200 to 400-year sentence. True story. And we've got 4,500 people who are serving life sentences. 3,500 of them about are life without parole sentences. So you can't be granted parole. It's life without parole. And that could be for first-degree murder. That breaks down to do a couple different things. But it also applies to, like, aiding and abetting first-degree murder. And I don't want to get too deep into, like, legalities here, but when we're talking about aiding and abetting felony murder, which is first-degree murder, it could be, I drove my boyfriend he was going to steal some stuff from this convenience store. And when he went into that convenience store, he pulled out a gun and it turned into an armed robbery. And there was a shootout between the two, and one of them died. And because somebody was killed during the commission of this armed robbery, it's now felony murder. There was no premeditation, but there was premeditation to do the armed robbery. So they transfer this intent. Is first-degree murder is a mandatory life without parole sentence, unless you're under the age of 19 now in Michigan. But the mandatory life without parole sentence also applies to the girlfriend who was driving the car for the boyfriend who was just going to go in and steal some stuff. No idea like a murder was going to take place. But that's felony murder that happens in there, and the person who's driving is now aiding and abetting, and that's also a mandatory life without parole sentence. So we've got lots of different variances on all of these life without parole sentences that we've got in Michigan. And there's no way we can ask a governor to go through each single application and figure out different accomplice liability and different extenuating circumstances and the person's age and who they were being influenced by and their upbringing. Like, a governor's office just does not have that capacity. Judges, of course, do. And because we've got such a problem in Michigan right now with so many people serving these sentences, the biggest pushback that we've received about second look is this is going to flood the court's dockets. So many people are going to qualify for this, unfortunately, because so many people have served so long in Michigan. The pushback is it's going to flood court's dockets. And boy, that sucks for judges, I'm sure. But we've got people serving year after year after year after year, and this costs money. There's sunk costs here that nobody thinks about in a life without parole sentence. We can think about first-degree premeditated murder, and holy cow, this son of a gun who went and killed this person, we're angry and we hate them. And maybe we don't hate them, but we're still very angry and frustrated and upset and sad about what happened. And we always rely on punishment. And we want to punish this out of the person to make sure they never do it again. But at some point, our thirst or our hunger for punishment has to stop, right? Day after day, month after month, year after year, Teresa Dunlap went in to prison on a life without parole sentence. She was addicted to heroin at the time and got caught up in some heroin wars, and there was a lot of shooting and fighting and bad stuff going on between two groups. And she went into prison when she was 20. She spent 47 years in prison before she died of stage 4 cancer. And that's 47 years of expensive costs just to keep somebody in prison, not because they're eating so well, but because corrections officers have pretty good retirements and pretty good wages. So just in addition to the institutional costs of keeping her there for 47 years, which they've averaged out as $45,000 a year for each person in prison. $45,000 every single year, and that's an average. The older people get, the more expensive they are because of healthcare costs. But 47 years she spent in there before she died in there, and I don't know that anybody feels like, okay, justice was done now that she's died in there. I don't know if anybody actually feels like 47 years in prison being punished day after day after day by a prison regime, right? This is not making us a better society. It's not making us a better world. And it certainly didn't help the 2-year-old son that she left behind with nobody to raise him. And Marseille's in rough shape right now. He grew up without his mom, never had a holiday dinner with his mom, couldn't even go in and have a nice visit with her because she was in the infirmary before she died. She couldn't come out to the visiting room in the prison. So the 15-minute visits that they were allowed in the infirmary, like that's what they had the last 6 months of her life. So this is cruel. We don't need to treat people this way, regardless of what they did. If there's people that we can't trust in society because we think that they're going to harm somebody again, that's reason to keep them in prison, right? But I guarantee you we don't have 3,500 people in prison serving life without parole that we can never trust again out here. And it's a ton of money to keep them in there. So I get involved in all of this work, and I got to go way, way, way back now, back to the 90s. In 1994, here I am back in Troy. I was born in Mount Clemens. When I was 4 years old, my dad was a tool and die maker for Ford. We moved out to the country. We bought property and built a house in Dryden, which is if you go straight up Rochester Road into Lapeer County, we were right there. So I grew up in Dryden, graduated from high school in Dryden, had to come down here to Rochester sometimes in the summer to do summer school because I did not do well in school. Graduated with night school and summer school. I graduated with a 1.05 GPA. And after I graduated, I was working as a welder. I had a friend die in a car accident, and me and a couple other friends who wanted to be big gangsters back then, we were out stealing things and whatnot. We got into armed robberies, and let's see, it was June of 1994. Me and my friend Sean, we stole the pickup truck, we robbed a convenience store, and afterwards we got in a shootout with some police who were trying to arrest us. And of course, I was shooting at the police thinking, we've got to get away. If we get caught, this threat of punishment, I can't deal with that. I'm not going to prison for the rest of my life, which I wouldn't have to start with for the armed robbery, but I thought that. That was the fear in my head. This is what we instill in kids. If you do this and you get caught, you're going to prison for the rest of your life. So it made all the sense in the world to me at 19 years old. I'm just going to shoot my way out of this because if I just give up, I'm going to prison. So I'm going to try to get out of it. Nobody was hurt. I didn't get out of it. I went to prison. I tried to escape from prison. Got caught, didn't get out, and added more time onto my prison sentence. Ended up spending 14 years in prison, 10 years in solitary confinement for the attempted escape. So, somebody mentioned waiting for Godot earlier. Thank you for that. Yeah, I got into Beckett and all kinds of stuff while I was in the hole. I was in the hole by the time I was, I think, 21. No, I was 20 by the time I got to the hole, and spent that decade of my life in solitary confinement, and knew I was going to be in there for a while, and felt like, well, all that stuff that I was supposed to have read in high school, I better start reading it now. I'm going to get another shot down the road at some point to go to college, and I've got time to read right now, so I started reading. My aunt sent in Dostoevsky and Dickens, and I loved Dostoevsky, didn't think much of Dickens, and just kind of went from there, and ended up in Samuel Beckett, so thanks for that. So let's see, the decade in the hole, because I mentioned this earlier, like we don't think much of 10 years anymore. Anybody here use social media? Like Instagram's about like the one that I do, because it's not too many comments, it's just pictures. I could deal with the pictures more than all of the commentary. But there was a recent one that came out where people were posting their pictures from when they turned 21, right? And I was like, oh, this is gonna be terrible. I'm gonna have like this ridiculous mullet that I used to have before I went to prison. And then I thought about it again, and I was like, oh no, I was in prison when I was 21. I was in the hole when I was 21. And it dawned on me then, I don't have any pictures of myself in my 20s, that whole decade, because I was in solitary confinement. The Department of Corrections might have a mugshot of me from some point in there where I just woke up and they were like, it's time to get your pictures taken. But I don't have any pictures for that decade. And that's my 20s. And that's a decade. That's a long time in somebody's life. So like this pushback that we're hearing right now is like, oh, 10 years isn't long enough for a judge to reconsider somebody's cases. 10 years is a long time. And if any of us in this room sit down and think about like what we've done for the past 10 years and all that we've experienced and all we've grown, especially if we're thinking about our 20s, right? We think very, very differently coming into our 20s than coming into our 30s. I'm going to be coming into my 50s in May, and I think very, very differently than I was coming into my 20s back in the 90s. And I'm, as Ronnie said, I'm not a big threat. I'm not going to be chasing after and robbing people on the Michigan Supreme Court, right? It was last year when Justice Kyra Bolden was appointed to the court, she hired me as her clerk. And 3 days into the job, Justice Bernstein created this big, whatever. And me and him are fine by now. We've had a good talk, and he apologized. And he's offered me a clerk position. But when it all happened, I remember the first thing on one of the shows was Ronnie went onto the show to talk about what had happened. And I remember him saying, like, Pete Martell's not going to be robbing people and shooting at people on the Michigan Supreme Court. And that was just my kind of humor. I loved it. I thought, thank you, Ronnie, for that. But, yeah, no, we all change. We all change. And we grow up and we mature. And whether it become worse or better as we age, like we can say it goes both ways. But I promise you, we become more risk averse across the board. Nobody wants to roll the dice in their 50s that they were willing to roll in their teens or maybe their early 20s. That's something that changes across the board. So the risk-taking behavior and the willingness to do things, it just doesn't exist, regardless of who you've become over the many, many years. So this idea of zero tolerance, you've got to go to prison for the rest of your life. It doesn't matter what you do from here to the end of your life. You're never going to have a chance to get back out. This really undermines what we want to accomplish with the legal system, right? We want people to become good people. We want people to come back out here and be contributing members of society and growing our communities into stronger, healthier places. And most of the people that I did time with, and most of the people that I've worked with while I've been at AFSC, most of the people that I've met along the way are the people who have served long time in there. When I first went to the hole for that attempted escape, I remember hearing from people out, because I was at Ionia Max, which was Super Max, level 6 at the time. I remember hearing from people out of the windows while I was out in the little yard cage by myself. They'd be talking to other people, and I remember like little nuggets of golden advice. And I remember this old head talking to somebody else saying, you meet so few good people in prison, and we were at Supermax at the time, that when you do come across a good person, don't screw that up. Don't take advantage of them. Don't screw it up. You know, honor that, appreciate that, and don't screw it up, because we don't come across many good people in here. And that's probably true up in Supermax, but there's so many people that I met up in Supermax or level 5 maximum security that started to get their things together in there, and they'd work their way down in security level, and they'd end up getting out of prison on parole, like me, right? And there's just a lot of good people and real honest-to-God potential in those prisons right now that we're paying for just to keep in there year after year after year. So the second look legislation, I've been working on it. I spent last term with a team of 5 Masters of Public Policy students at the Ford School. They were modeling potential cost savings under second look. And when they took our current prison population, kids these days with their technology, they did this scrape from the Department of Corrections website. There's this thing called OTIS, Offender Tracking Information System, where you can look individuals up by their prison number. They developed this web scraping tool that the MDOC numbers go 000, 000, up to 999,999. So it just queries the website. And every time, adding one number at a time, every time they get a return of somebody who's currently in prison, their tool scrapes all the data off of that page. So we know their date of birth, the race that the Department of Correction assigns to them, the gender that the Department of Correction assigns to them, date of the offense, the county that the crime was in, what the crime was, what the minimum and maximum sentences are, all of this good information. They scrape it all, and we clean it, and we organize it, and then we start modeling. Like, our model looks like if we take people in Michigan's prisons who are currently serving minimum sentences between 15 and 20 years, okay, this 5-year block. Anybody who has to serve that amount of time before they become eligible for parole, our model is going to say, under second look, judges will resentence them to 10 years. It's between 5 and 10 years off their current sentence. Still 10 years. I promise you, it's still a long time if you're sitting in a cell. People who are serving between 20 and 30 years, our model brings them down to 15 years. So it's like this, right? We're grasping the real high end, and we're bringing it down to where people are serving, instead of between 15 and life without parole, people are serving between 10 and 25 years. 25 years is a lot. If we go back to the 1960s, the Department of Corrections had a program where, well, they had the parole board had all kinds of discretion to let people out pretty much whenever they wanted under something called the lifer law. But even people who were serving the first-degree murder, life without parole cases, those sentences, as a matter of general practice, again and again and again, they would get out no later through a commutation of 25 years. And like I've done archival research. I've got these memos from the parole board to the director, Gus Harrison, and then Gus Harrison writing a letter over to the governor, Governor Romney at the time, saying, hey, we've had this program, this first-degree murder program, where we're sending our recommendations over to you at around 25 years, maybe a little bit less, and you grant these commutations, and we keep our lifer population low, and that keeps morale up in here. It keeps our population low, so we can provide services to people and programs to people and keep things moving, because just keeping people in here and having an aging population just makes zero sense. Between the 30s and 1960, Director Gus Harrison writes in his memo to the governor, between 1930s and right now, we've tracked this program of the first-degree murder people who are released, and it's the lowest recidivism rate that we've got across the board. These people get out after serving their sentences and getting their commutations. They don't come back. They were in a heat-of-the-moment thing. It was a first-degree murder case. It was horrible. Nobody supports this. Nobody wants to be easy on people if they think it's going to lead them to commit murder again. But at the end of the day, we pay for this. And there's always an opportunity cost. There's always a marginal cost. So yes, that's where we got the 25 years from, is this old practice that is documented pretty well about really low recidivism rates. So we take this model, right, where this big range of minimum sentences is pulled down to this smaller range between 10 and 25 years, and we say, okay, for the people who are now resentenced under our model to 10 years, we're going to only look at those people who already have 10 years served, and we'll assume parole, okay? The people who go from the 20 to 30-year sentences, and this comes down to a 15-year min, only the people who have 15 years served, and they qualify for parole. And so on and so forth. The people with the larger ones, we bring those down to 20 years, only the people who have 20 years served. And then for the people who are serving life sentences, they come down to 25, only the lifers who have 25 years served. This is our group under our model. And if those people were released today, it's 5,400 people, right? It's 5,400, and there will be more who get the resentence and then serve the minimum sentences, but just the ones who have served that already, 5,400 people. That's 5 facilities in Michigan right now. And when we look at the facilities, a little bit more data, but a little bit more data. Right now, the corrections officers, statewide, the vacancies are almost 1,900. All the facilities that we've got in the state, right, there's 1,900 correctional officers vacancies. They've had this for years and years, and they can't bring people in and keep them there because they're short-staffed so much that the officer goes in for his morning shift, and when he finishes his 8-hour shift, he's mandated because they don't have enough people for second shift. Mandated means you can't leave. If you leave, you're going to get disciplinary action. You're going to get paid time, or you're going to get unpaid time off. So they're stuck there for 16-hour shifts. And then they can't be mandated again. They go home. They probably eat a little bit. Hopefully they shower. They come back the next morning. They might get mandated again for another 16-hour shift. And when you're bringing new employees into that environment where everybody is at their wits' end, nobody wants to stick around in that. They'll take the $500 hiring bonus, But once that year's up, they're out of there, right? So they can't keep staff on because of the staffing shortages. They can't do programs. They can't deliver health care. Women's Huron Valley, the only women's prison in the state of Michigan, it has 1,600 women there. For over 2 years now, they've had 55 vacancies in health care alone. Just in health care. I didn't know they had that many positions in health care. But women are sending in kites requesting health care for lots of different things, and like, good luck hearing back. Oh, you sprained your wrist, you might hear back in like 6 months. Like women with stage 4 cancer, women who are supposed to be going out to get chemotherapy on a weekly basis, they can't keep up with the med runs. So it's like, oh, sorry, we missed every other week for a number of months, right? This is what we're seeing right now. Everything is kind of crumbling and collapsing on itself. But to get back to my model, with the 5,400 people who could be released under this model and the 5 facilities, we take the 5 facilities that have the highest vacancy rates for corrections officers, and let's close those 5 facilities down. Because that gets all of those corrections officer vacancies off the books, because the facilities are closed down. The officers who work there now go out to backfill at other facilities in the area, and our CO vacancy rate goes from almost 1,900 down to 300 and some. So we've got staffing issues taken care of there. The 5 facilities that we closed down is $200 million a year in facility costs every single year. It's not a one-time savings, right? We close these 5 facilities, it's $200 million a year. And now we're talking about like thinking about all of the costs that we've got here and what can we do with this money instead. And $200 million a year, like, I don't know what all we can do with it. I'm not a policymaker, but I'm sure every region, every neighborhood, wherever you're at, has a good idea of what we could do with that money, rather than what we're getting out of Ms. Dunlap dying after serving 47 years in there. Like, had she been released at the 25-year mark, she's not going to get out and get back into heroin and get into a heroin war and be involved with, somebody's murder again. That's just not going to happen. What she's going to be there for her son. She's going to have some holiday meals with her son before she dies. And we're going to get on with a society that has her as part of it, rather than forgetting about her and all of these years passing and she passes away in there. So this is why we're very, very big on second look right now. I've gone on and on and on, and I just need a sip of water. Yeah, put the question.
So I think a lot of the crimes that people are serving time for are not, they're not necessarily victimless, but at the same time, they're not, they're drug offenses and things like that. But certainly some of them, there are. So are there victims advocacy groups that you work with, and how do they see this, and how, because that's going to be the first argument made, right?
Yeah, no questions.
I think it's important to hear what I'm curious what they said, or how you work with them.
When we drafted the bill, it was sent out to different organizations, and the one that we heard back from, I don't remember specifically which one it was, their feedback was, we think that we're probably neutral on this, except we have these concerns. And these concerns were, what about people who are convicted of criminal sexual conduct where the victim is under 13? Because research shows, this is what they say, I don't know that it's right, but they say research shows that people don't grow out of that. And what about domestic violence? And what about human trafficking? And I guess before we even got to that, as we were drafting the bill, it was, let me think, I think it was shortly after the shooting up at Michigan State. And there's a no-no, a complete exception if you're convicted of a mass shooting. So that was at the outset. If you're convicted of a mass shooting, you don't get to apply for this. Okay. But when we get the feedback from this advocacy group with these concerns, we say, okay, this is easy enough. And we go through the penal code and we look up all of these statutes, and anybody who's convicted of any of these offenses, they can apply for it, but the judge can just screen those cases and say, issue an order that says, nope, not interested right now. You can apply again in 5 years if you want. But so judges can just screen it. They're not guaranteed a hearing and whatever else. But at the end of the day, whenever we're doing public policy talk about criminal justice and punishment and the legal system, we always bring up the worst case scenario, and like that's not good public policy. Nor is it to bring up the best case scenario. We've just got to think about what sort of process can we set up to safeguard who's being released, who is in a good position to figure out who needs to still be in prison and who can be released from prison. And like that's what judges do. Two questions, and in case anybody couldn't hear, or are we streaming? Is this why I've got this mic? Okay, so in case you can't hear on the stream, the first question was about privatization in Michigan and prisons and how everything grew and to what extent that was part of it. And the second was with the judges' pushback of the dockets being flooded, are there conversations or thoughts about creating new benches or maybe appointing new judges, adding to the judges that we have here in circuit courts to help address this initial wave of resentencings. First question is about privatization. We don't have any privatized prisons in Michigan right now. We have, along the way, here and there, a little bit. There was the youth prison up in Baldwin. That was a private prison that's shut down. We don't have it anymore. We don't have privatized prisons. People in Michigan's prisons, they're all state-run. There's a lot of privatized services that go on. So phone calls, this JPay electronic communications, the store food that people incarcerated buy through the commissary. These are all privatized things. And no question, Tom Gores, the owner of the Pistons, who owns Securus, is making a ton of money off of people trying to stay in touch with their family while they're in prison, right? But privatization isn't the kind of like sexy op-ed issue that we would normally read about in a lot of different places. But we still have the same phenomenon because we still live in this free market capitalist society where we build a prison up in the UP and it's state-run, and then you get all of these people who come there and they have jobs there and they're making $60, $70, $80, $100,000. They're spending all of those dollars in that community. And that community becomes dependent on those state dollars for all of the local restaurants and businesses and whatever else is going on. And if you close the prison down, everybody in that community comes out with their signs. You can't close this prison down. What are we going to do? And that's a literal serious issue to deal with, but we cannot keep people in prison simply so other people can have jobs. Because it's a bunch of young black guys from Southeast Michigan who end up at these facilities all over the rest of the state, and their lives are being imprisoned so these white people in these communities in the UP can have jobs and businesses and family restaurants and whatever. We can't have that. So I think that's all I've got on like privatization. Like, just because it's public doesn't mean like the same thing isn't going on. The second question about the judges, what we've got out of our research project is we can track and see, of course, we have a chart that shows all of these people serving these really, really long sentences, what counties do they come from? Is this a statewide issue where judges across the state are going to have these huge influence? And no, it's Wayne County. Wayne County, almost 6,000 cases, right? And then the next one drops down is, I think, Oakland County, which is closer to like 1,400. So it's not even close. And then it continues to drop down to where you really get to most of the out counties is like, oh, we're talking about 10 people, we're talking about 8 people, we're talking about 5 people. So I think if we're looking at additional judges, it's maybe adding a couple judges in Wayne County, maybe a judge or two in Oakland and like Kent. But like this. Yes. No. Appreciate that. Was there, yeah,
So, if you have somebody who's in prison for first-degree murder,
Mhm.
and they murdered a family member, because I happen to know somebody who did that, he probably isn't gonna kill somebody else. Okay? So if he gets out of prison, he probably can't go back to the community he was living in, because community is like really torn apart.
Mhm.
So do you help that person find someplace else to live? Because he can't go back to the old community he lived in. Like, it's just not, I don't think it's feasible.
I think it very much depends on the situation. And I don't doubt at all that you're spot on with this situation. And I don't know. So at our office, we just don't have capacity to help with reentry too. And we're not a reentry thing. We'd like to grow into that, but maybe once we pass second look, we can like work on that stuff. But different reentry places, the Department of Corrections is the first step for placing someone where they're supposed to go. And their default setting is you go back to, and the Department of Corrections is going to fund your reentry according to where you were locked up at, which isn't, that's like not a great recipe for what you're trying to address. Okay. Yeah, but I mean, no, mid-Michigan, Midland area. Yes. So, but wherever he committed the offense. So if he committed the offense in Oakland County? Okay. Okay. So the default setting, the default would be he would go back to where the crime was committed. And the second thing that they look at is, do you have housing there? And if you don't have housing from like a family member or a friend that we feel like is a decent setting, then they'll start looking at other places. But the community placement, if you don't have someone to live with, would at least start with the county in which you were convicted. Yeah. Does that sound right, Ronnie? Thank you. Yes.
Have you noticed, also, let me explain first. So one of my close girlfriends is a Methodist minister. She's in Northern Ohio. So this is not Michigan, this is Ohio. When she was working on her PhD, and then even after she got it, she was spending a lot of time in the prison ministry.
Mhm.
And also, once she got into that, she really then found it so fulfilling, and then she started teaching literature classes for like associates level. Then COVID hit, no visitors of any kind.
Yep.
And they tried to bring a lawsuit and say, well, we're the ministry, and the Constitution, they have a right to have us there. No, state of emergency, you can't come. And she's still fighting. 4 years later, she's still fighting to try and get back to just teach, bring books, just meet with people. They're still shutting it out because under the guise of COVID. And that is Ohio, but so are you seeing, is it just as bad here? Is it the same here? Are you looking?
There's a number of issues that are being carried over that were implemented under COVID, right, or during COVID, or during when everything was completely locked down. There's a number of measures that were implemented then that are still being used right now in terms of like if you want to visit someone. When I got locked up in '94, they were just changing over the visitation policy, and it used to be as long as you've got an ID with you, you could stop by a prison during visiting hours and go in and say, I want to have a visit with so-and-so, and they'd bring the person up in the visiting room and you would have their visit, right? '94, when I came in, what changed over was we're not doing that anymore. You need to write out this list of 20 people, identify what your relationship is to them, and you can change this once a year. And those people, you'll have to send applications to, they'll have to fill out all of this stuff, send it back to the facility, and they'll have to get approved to visit. And once they're approved on your visiting list, they can come in during these times, visiting hours. And the visiting hours, like it might be on a Saturday, it might be a 12-hour shift. And my parents could come in for 6 hours if they wanted to stick around for and eat junk food out of the vending machine or whatever. During COVID, all visitation was stopped. And when they started to reopen it, what they did was they created this thing where you have to now log on to a website to schedule a visit that's in 2-hour blocks, and you're only allowed one 2-hour block. Maybe you can do back-to-back, but you're allowed a limited number of visits per month. So if you can't make it for that 2-hour block at some point, you got to cancel it ahead of time, and you're not going to be able to reschedule because everything's booked. So this is kind of like the carryover that they're still using, and they like how that runs. They know when people are coming. They know when they're going to have to staff the visiting rooms, and blah, blah, blah. It's incredibly burdensome, cumbersome for people who are trying to visit their loved ones inside. I do think we have religious groups going back in, at least to some facilities. I don't know if that's statewide. But I do know we have people going into some facilities over in Jackson, Adrian, Gus Harrison, Women's Huron Valley. I haven't heard lately anybody who's being denied. I don't know that I would hear that, though.
Well, I appreciate what you're doing, taking this out of the reliance on like a governor to commute sentences and putting it back in the hands of judges because, as you said, administrative burden is just too great, but also politically you got sort of like a Willie Horton effect where
Yes.
governors don't want to get tagged with, oh, you let this person out and then that person did X, even though, as you said, it's unlikely, but that small chance is enough to
Yeah.
really cause a fear in them to make the right decisions. But I was also wondering, in terms of your economic model, there's the cost savings part where, okay, they're not in prison, so all these services in prisons and people aren't really needed to incarcerate people. But on the other half of the economic model, is there a calculation, okay, these people are back in the community, hopefully if they're out early enough, they're going to be working, they're taxpayers, and is that calculated in that all that money that's coming to the state through their earnings?
So the model that we've got is already incredibly tenuous because of the assumptions that we build into it, right? And the more that we want to do that, like the less reliable we can communicate the outcomes of it. But yeah, I mean, we can keep layer upon layer of different costs. With like, you could also bring in costs to the communities in the UP where that prison closes down. These are negative costs. It's going to be right. So you can keep adding on to this. So we wanted to just kind of keep it, yeah. Because those are huge assumptions. Thank you, guys. Huge assumptions in just like judges doing this. Judges won't. Michigan judges are Michigan judges, and they've been raised in this culture of tough punishment. I think we've seen judges learn a lot because of the juvie lifer resentencings. So people who are coming back after Miller and Montgomery, people who are coming back to get resentenced because they had to, because the U.S. Supreme Court said you have to do this, judges would see people who had been in for 30, 40, 50, 60 years and be blown away by like, geez, I can't believe all that you've done in this time, and that you found ways to do it, and as a lifer, you weren't prioritized, you were prevented from doing it, you found your way how to get into this program, you've been doing great stuff in there. My gosh, we don't need to keep you. So we see that with a lot of judges along the way. And I think the juvie lifer resentencings are a really, really good basis for just encouraging judges to revisit, look at the person, who they are now, what they've done throughout their incarceration, and kind of measure like, and of course they don't have to resentence them to like, okay, now you're ready to go, now you're eligible for parole. They could reduce the sentence for somebody who's got 20 years in, they could reduce the sentence to a 30-year min and say, okay, you've got 10 more years to go, right? They can reduce it to pretty much whatever they want. But yeah, no, the modeling, it can get really, really fun to imagine all of this stuff, but every layer that we add onto it, it becomes less reliable then.
This is just an informational question about the prison system. I became aware, naive as I was, I became aware just within the last 5 years, 10 years, whatever, that there are costs that are assigned to people who are in prison just for being there, okay, that they have to pay
Yeah, so fines and fees, and these can be like restitution from sentencing. There's just administrative costs that have been added on over the decades of like, oh, you wanted to commit this crime, you needed a court-appointed attorney, we're gonna add this fee to your prison sentence that you gotta pay along the way. People going into prison, like if you start work in the kitchen, and this has been the same since at least the early 80s, maybe further back. I don't want to age you, Ronnie, but let me know if this is wrong. If you start in the kitchen, you're being paid 17.5 cents an hour. And you can get a raise up to 23 cents an hour, and then you get another raise if you do a lead position, you're going to make 32 cents an hour. And the amount of things that have been shifted from the state providing it for free because you're incarcerated to you need to buy that out of the commissary store has been like everything they could possibly unload along the way. And the prices on the commissary store, like living out here, have continued to go up because what you pay for aspirin out here, you're probably going to pay a little bit more in there, even though you're only making 17 cents an hour. So where it used to be like you could go to healthcare, they would give you over-the-counter medication. You won't get that at all anywhere anymore. You've got to buy all of that off the store list, which runs every 2 weeks. So if you're sick and you need some medication, the nurse or provider will tell you, you've got to get that off the store list. And if store just ran in your unit, you're waiting 2 weeks to get that medication then. Things that used to be handed out like soap and deodorant and tooth powder and little toothbrushes. Tooth powder came in a little envelope and you would dump some powder on your and brush your teeth. Like they used to give that to you if you didn't have enough money to get it off of the store list. You won't get any of that anymore. You've got to find a way to come up with some money in there to make your store. So this is like what it costs to live in prison. If you have people out in the world who can send you money, that can be really, really helpful. If you don't, good luck. I don't know what you're trying to live off of a prison job in there, you're not going to get very much. And every time you go to healthcare, there's a $5 copay. And now it's down to like $1.50 to call home. Most recently it was like $2, and before that it was much more money. But so it costs people to live in prison. It costs their families as well if they want to keep in touch with them. But when we're thinking about all of these fines and fees, like I just wanted to give you that context to start with. The fines and fees that are administered by the court, it could be the stuff from your sentencing court. It could also be, I filed a lawsuit against this corrections officer who was sexually harassing me, discriminating against me on the basis of race, whatever the case might be. There's lots of lawsuits that get filed. And you can't come up with a $300 or $400 filing fee. So the court holds that above you and says, okay, for every order that you have, anybody who sends you money in, anything over $50 a month, we're going to take 50% of it. Which is like, okay, you're going to take 50% for that court-ordered restitution. But then I also have this other thing that I owe for this civil complaint that I filed, and that court's going to get the other 50% over the $50, right? So the rule is you could take 50% over everything that's sent to you over $50, the state can take 50%, but now they've cut that up to like as many hands can grab that. They just divide it up. So if you've got people who are sending you money, you can get $50 a month, and everything else could be taken very, very easily if you owe those things. Movement on improving fines and costs, not so much. Phone costs are down right now, but people are spending like, I think 23 cents a stamp to send an electronic message out to somebody for this JPay service. Or if I email them back, it's 23 cents per letter, right? If I add a picture to it, that's another 23 cents. If I add 2 pictures, it's 2 stamps to add the 2 pictures, right? So, yeah, they're cleaning up with all that.
That's for an electronic service?
Yes, their email, you have to pay, you need e-stamps, is what I think they call that.
So when people leave prison, they leave with lots of bills?
How much is paid off? Like it completely varies, and what the restitution is. Some of the latest thing, yes, to answer the question simply, yes. But like the latest thing is, we've seen people who are in solitary confinement with serious and persistent mental illness who try to commit suicide while they're in solitary confinement. And if it's a serious enough attempt and the department has to do an ambulance run to get the person out to the hospital, they're going to get that bill. And it's going to be thousands and thousands and thousands of dollars. Because, Jesus, what are you doing trying to kill yourself?
So unless you have a wealthy family on the outside, when you leave prison, you're bound to leave with a bill.
Depends when you got locked up, depends how much you paid over the time, but yeah, it could very well be. There's one thing that they make sure that they get right up front, and there's, I don't know if it's $75 or $40, or it may have changed a long time. There is a Crime Victims Benefit Fund that everybody has to pay into, and everybody does. It's a small amount, and like that's got to be done. What happens to the other fees that are left out there? It's going to depend on the person. It's going to probably depend on a parole agent and who's doing what in what region. But in fairness, there's not that many people who have really wealthy families out in the world who are in prison, because we don't lock up that many people who have a lot of wealth.
Wow, so then this follows you, this bill follows you when you come back out into the world.
Mhm.
And I mean, it seems to me like if you didn't get a job that paid that much money, when you finally get out, you could always have this hanging over you. Can the state then sue you?
They could, of course they could. I don't know how often they do. And also, I don't know, I'm not in a good position to know that either, but yes, people come out with bills that are still owed. I don't know how much the department tries to track them down on that. It's like, what, put you back in prison because you couldn't afford this bill? That's not a great look.
I mean, what made me think of all this is the horrible thing in Florida, where that was voted that, if you served your time, you should automatically be able to vote in Florida, until DeSantis got legislature to say, no, if you still owe fees
Yeah.
from when you were in prison,
Yes.
you can't vote until those are paid off. And if you try to vote because you don't know about this, that you
That's-
could be prosecuted for
This is a new
fraud.
felon, yes. Yeah. Yes.
I have a quick question. I didn't know about a lot of the COVID restrictions. What about the prison art program? Are those people allowed to come back in now?
Yes, I was just at PCAP, the Prison Creative Arts Project at the University of Michigan. I was just over there yesterday helping them tag and label pictures. Their 28th annual art exhibit opens on the 19th of this month. So, it's at University of Michigan. It's on North Campus, on Bonesteel Road, 1300 Bonesteel? If you just do UMich PCAP, you'll find it. Let me get his first.
In a lot of cases where the person's been in prison for quite a while, and then it comes up maybe they should be paroled or not, and then they always mention what the victim's family wants. Sometimes, no, this person should never get out. Sometimes the victim's family advocates, yeah, we think he should get out now. Well, how much weight should what the victim's family want should factor into whether the person gets an early out or not?
Yeah. I've got two avenues kind of to answer that. And legally, like what I'm taught in law school is criminal courts are for the state as a party versus the person who broke the state's law. And those are the parties, right? If you've got a problem with something that somebody did to you, or a company or somebody other than the government, what they did to you, you sue them in civil court. And if they've wronged you, what do? We pay money in America, right? We pay money. Oh, sorry you lost your arm because of my negligence. I'm going to just pay you some money for that. But that's civil court. But that's how we do conflict between parties, unless the government's a party. If the government's prosecuting, then I think it needs to be the government and the person. And when we started to bring everybody else in, makes sense politically. Like, there's a lot of political power for that. We're going to protect all of the victims. And who doesn't want to be protected if you're a victim, right? So I feel like legally, what you're taught in law school, what the legal system should be, and what it's supposed to be, like, no, that shouldn't be part of it. There should be some other arena, avenue, place to do that outside of the courts and the legal system and like punishment. that's a legal thing. And there's serious problems with relying on the legal system too much. There's also just, we're a community. We're human beings trying to live with other human beings. And we need community, we need communication. Where we have problems with each other, we need to be able to talk about it. Because if we rely on punishment, if we rely on violence to combat violence, that's just never going to work. It's just going to spin out of control. This is where we're at. So maybe getting people together, and it's going to look very, very different depending on what the wrong was, who the people are involved, but coming up with ways to foster discussion and understanding and places where people can get an understanding about, like, why did you do this to me? Do you understand what that did to me? We do not get that at all in the courts, because the victim of the crime and the person who committed the crime, especially the person who committed the crime, they're told from day one, don't you ever talk to that person, don't you ever reach out to that person. If you try to, you might be looking at more time, you're probably going to go to solitary confinement, and if you're ever coming up for parole and you're trying to send letters to the victim of your crime, like, we're not going to let you go. You shouldn't be trying to contact them. Do you know what that must be like for them? And, like, that's not a good system to attempt to foster communication and healing. It prevents it. So then somebody sits there for 30 years just imagining, like, how come I never heard from this son of a gun? How come they never apologized? What were they thinking? And they just imagine for 30 years. And if I imagine on something for 30 years, at the end of it, it's not going to be a very accurate representation of reality. It's going to be all of my worst fears bundled up into a big, nasty, toxic package. So I think along the way, we need to do much, much better with figuring out how can we get people to communicate about this stuff. How can the victim share how much you hurt me, rather than just showing up into court for a day and saying, you know, I get to give my 2 cents during this sentencing hearing, and you hurt me so much, and you know, I want you to suffer a bunch for it. But it's like once communication starts happening, then people can start talking through stuff and maybe at least get to the verge of considering forgiveness and understanding. Is that helpful? Yeah. Each to it.
Just saying, on that same score, when information goes the other way, when the victim starts understanding the backstory on the person that committed this crime, it sometimes really changes their view of what should happen next. And I've seen that any number of times where someone was out for blood, and then they suddenly, when they hear in open court what this person's life was like, they suddenly say, no, I don't want this person prosecuted.
Yeah.
Which is kind of, this is astonishing turnabout.
Yeah. What we don't know about people astounds me. And I really started to learn that when I finally got into assaultive offender program, and it was way after I was in solitary confinement, because you got to be in a lower security level to get into that. When I got into it, and I was in a group with 11 other guys who had been in prison for a while, and I heard about what they went through growing up. I was just, it was appalling for me. A really nice guy who was a real sweetheart, who came in when he was young, and he was like big enough that nobody was going to mess with him. But when he was talking about, like, the only contact I ever had with my dad, he might pick me up once a month, and we would walk around, and I'd go to different bars with him, and between the bars, he would point people out to me and say, I want you to go fight that person. And I would go and try to win the fight to make my dad proud. That was his interaction with it. That was his upbringing. That's what he had with his dad. And I was like, oh my God, dude. Like, what people have gone through before they get to prison is, it's astounding. And when here's the other thing is, why we're like half on second look and half on women's applications for commutation is 1,600 women locked up. Almost 600 of them are doing life or really, really long sentences. And as we work on these and get to know them and find out what they've been through, the 200 women who are serving life in Michigan, the average age at the time of the offense was 32 years old. Women are 5% of the prison population, so we never really get into this subgroup, if I can call it that. We never get into the subgroup and really like study it very well about, like, to where we would realize, wow, the path to prison for women, on average, statistically, is way, way, way different from us guys who are young and dumb and want to prove to people like how brave we are and how risky we're willing to behave or whatever. The 200 women who are serving life, 32 years old, and it's year after year, layer upon layer of trauma and abuse, and finally they hit a point and it's like, enough's enough, and they shoot somebody who might be a current abuser, or it might just be a reaction of everything that they've had to deal with for so long with no help. They've called police like, oh, sorry, we can't help you with that. And like they hear that one time and they're not calling the police again. And it's just atrocious histories that we're trying to give as the best voice to that we can to represent them in the governor's office. But this is stuff the judges should be considering, and in an initial, especially where it's a mandatory life without parole sentence, none of that even matters, because the judge couldn't do anything anyways.
You mentioned earlier that there's a lack of staffing, and I know it's system-wide, but you mentioned it specifically the women's prison. So much so that healthcare is being denied, very much delayed, and obviously the Eighth Amendment guards against that as being cruel and unusual punishment. What about factoring into this whole analysis the cost that could occur with, for example, a class action case where the government's going to have to pay out because people are being denied basic medical care as a factor in, hey, let's reduce the prison population and have it such that proper staffing is being provided, et cetera.
Yeah.
Is that something that's been considered, and if so, does it seem to be an issue that would be favorable to the discussion of closing down some of these sites?
It's been considered insofar as, since we started this women's commutation project in the summer of 22, 4 women that we've worked with have died inside. And I'm so sick of it. And I've worked at law firms that handle these cases. And I've
So I know from
yes.
as a litigator.
Oh, good. So let me get your card before I leave.
Well, I'm no longer working, but I've done the work. I've done the 1983 cases, and I know, and they're very, very hard to pursue.
Yeah.
But they're an important tool to at least get some relief and some accountability.
Yeah.
But I'm just thinking about it from the standpoint of an economic argument that the state might be concerned with. You've got people being denied basic medical care. That's a pretty serious violation.
Yeah, totally right. And I'm also like working with attorneys that I've been in the past, like introducing them to the families of women who have passed away. And that's going to be a mess for the department. I don't know how much policymakers start with, legislators specifically, thinking about the healthcare staffing levels are so low that people, women, specifically, because it's 55 vacancies of women's here in Valley, that women are dying because of this, and the lawsuits that we're going to add on to that. I think that there is kind of like an inherent trust of they're doing the best they can, so we don't need to think about lawsuits. Like, I don't know. Like, we're not at fault that we can't hire more people. Like, that's not a legal defense. I don't know that legislators can get it. All of my struggles right now are trying to convince legislators that truth in sentencing doesn't have anything to do with second look legislation. Truth in sentencing was enacted in 1998 and 2000, depending on the offense. And truth in sentencing was a federal program that said, here's all these federal dollars to your state if you buy into truth in sentencing. And what that means is you can't release people on parole early. They've got to serve, in Michigan, we adopted 100% of your minimum sentence you have to serve before we can release you. It's in the corrections code. It's in a parole statute. It's dealing with parole. You have to serve 100% of your minimum sentence. Great. This has nothing to do with criminal procedure or sentencing. If a judge reduces your sentence, you still have to serve 100% of your minimum. And I've got our Attorney General, our Democratic Attorney General, calling people, senators and friends and representatives' offices, whatever, saying, you can't support second look because it undermines truth in sentencing. Or it could, my legal opinion is that it conflicts with truth in sentencing. And it's like, ma'am, no, it does not. It has nothing to do. And maybe part of the problem was it was bundled with, not bundled with, but it was like introduced and rolled out a year ago with like good time and productivity credits and these other bills that, yes, there is a legal issue there. But this is not that. But like, just trying to get people to understand that is one thing. Getting into the costs of lawsuits down the road is like, yeah, yeah. You had a question earlier, Rochelle.
You answered it. You answered it
Okay.
about the prison art program.
Oh,
That's my question.
yes.
Yeah, because that's such a powerful program.
It is. I would agree. So it's open for at least 2 weeks, but it does open on the 19th, the opening night, the evening, at the Prison Creative Arts annual art exhibit. It's fabulous. So many people show up, and people who were incarcerated, who are now out, they come out and talk about the importance of PCAP and art from while they were in. It's a great thing, but even if you can't get there opening night, it's open for at least 2 weeks. I'd encourage everybody to get over there. Opening night is March 19th. Yes.
Two things, and I think we're going to wrap it up, because we're at 2. Number one, I had a friend who was incarcerated and been in probably for 10 to 15 years, and he then, it's then discovered he had cancer, and as I understand it, according to his daughter, he was released early because the prison system did not want to keep paying for his medical bills.
Hmm.
State.
Was he in like stage 4? Was he fairly far along?
That I can't tell you.
Yeah, because sometimes they'll do it because of the clock.
So even under truth in sentencing, the parole board couldn't release him on parole before he served his minimum sentence. If he'd already served his minimum sentence and he was being denied parole, then they could totally make the decision to release him anytime after that. Another possibility is a medical commutation. If the minimum sentence was commuted by the governor, we also have, since I think 2016, we have a medical parole, not statute, it's the parole statute, and there's a section of that that is related specifically to medical issues, and the prosecutors had so much input on that to get it passed that I think maybe one person has been released under medical parole, because the department, the statute says that like, they need to screen low risk on a validated risk assessment, and it can't be anybody serving a life sentence, and like all of these things that get us to a point where it's like, okay, well, nobody's ever going to qualify under this. And we're working on that with Safe and Just Michigan right now, and the Department of Corrections to fix that. The Department of Corrections needs it, and I think that we can make the amendments that we need to that to make it a little bit more helpful, but it's still going to exclude people serving life sentences, whether that's life without parole or parolable life.
Last question, Pete. If you could just say a word or two about, I'm sitting here, I'm hearing this, second look sounds like something I really would like to see in action. What can I do?
Let's see. You can send Barry your email address, who can share it with me, and we can put you on a newsletter just to keep you updated on what's happening with Second Look. And you can absolutely contact me to talk more about it, or talk to your local legislators. I don't know, who are your local representatives and senators? Jeremy Moss is great. Okay. McMorrow. Okay. So I think they're both friendly. I've talked to. Pardon? Okay. So Rosemary Bayer has come out to one of our barbecues for Second Look. I've talked to Senator Moss. He's all in favor. Our office hasn't talked to Senator McMorrow. I don't know where she's at on it, but I think the Dems in the Senate are pretty solid. The House, it seemed like there was going to be more problems there, that things are starting to smooth out, but anybody in the House of Representatives, any state senators, they can always, it's never going to hurt to hear more support from their constituents. And if I can help with just getting you some talking points or whatever, please let me know. I'd happy to, like, we got a one-sheeter.
Should I have people sign up, like email or something?
Yeah.
That would be fabulous. Yes. I've also got cards I can just hang out and people can just email me. If that's.
Okay, well, I'd like to thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
I want to thank all so you're bringing it to the forefront, us understanding it better is so, so important. And hopefully all of us, another way that we can all help is take this and tell all your friends.
Mhm.
Have discussions with your friends about these issues that they don't normally see or think about, okay? Again, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
I just also want to say, this is the last of a series that Barry has been doing. And I would like all of you, thank you so much all for coming, but I also would still like to have your email because, again, I work with Nation Outside, I've been working with Safe and Just, and there's other legislation that they also are going to want support on. There's one on fair housing
Mm.
that they're looking for people that are returning citizens that we need, again, people that call their legislators and say, we really believe in this. So if you're willing to make those kinds of calls or whatever, please put your name down and I will be the person that sends you a paid. We could appreciate a phone call on X, Y, and Z with talking points, of course. Okay, so let me know, and Eric's too busy with water, so. He's got his hands full trying to make sure that we have affordable water.
Thank you all. Cards? Thank you. Cards, you guys good? Oops. Oh, sorry.
Yes, for your attention, Ronnie also wants to tell everybody something, so hang in for 1 second.
Yeah, just work with this wonderful person who runs for the Supreme Court judge. Her name is Kimberly Thomas.
Yes.
I'm sure people familiar with her stuff, and I would like for you guys just to scan this QR code and look her up because we really need these type of people on the Supreme Court.
And the Supreme Court is a nonpartisan appointment, so we didn't talk about any political.
That's right. That's right. Yes. But also, if you vote straight ticket, you need to make sure that you flip it over and vote for specifically the justices that you want.
Those things are that's what we do. We, as case judges, we pass out a recommended list.
Yes. Kim's an angel. Kim is a clinical professor at the University of Michigan. She's the one who got me out of solitary confinement finally. Yeah. Yeah, she's amazing. Yeah. Yeah.
Why do you think you got such poor grades all the way through high school?
I couldn't be bothered. I was more interested in drag racing and playing drums in a heavy metal band. Just couldn't be bothered.
Do you have attention deficit disorder?
Yes. Found out like after I got out of prison, right? They wouldn't diagnose it or treat it or anything in there, but yeah, once I got out of prison.
So do you think that had something to do with your poor grades?
I'm sure.
Concentrate in school and
Yeah.
do your homework?
Yeah, just couldn't stay focused on it. Had no interest in it, therefore couldn't focus on it. Yeah,
Are you taking any meds right now?
absolutely. Helps quite a bit. Since law school, actually. And it's like, wow, this makes all the difference in the world.
My grandson has that problem. His father told him that he should never take medicine.
They do. Also, like, who wants to be on medication when you don't have, like, studies knowing what it's actually doing to you long term? So there's, like I don't know. There's times where I'm like, okay, I've got things together enough. I'm gonna decrease and go off the medication, and then 6 months later, I'm back in the doctor's office.
My grandson, he's a bright person, but he just can't concentrate. So,
Can he concentrate on things that he is interested in?
yeah, video games.
Oh, yeah.